I'm Ro, welcome to the show. Welcome back to the Autopsy Book Club, a show that combines my English student love of books and my true crime research passion. Take a seat, pick up this week's book, and enjoy your time in the book club. This week's case follows the life and death of controversial American billionaire Jay Gatsby. The case that followed his death was incredibly high profile and garnered a significant amount of media attention. However, a lot of the information I will be using is from the released therapy notes of Nick Carraway.
Ooh, you know what color we haven't tried yet? Therapy.
And the diary of Gatsby's long-term lover, Daisy Buchanan. Before we get started though, the sensitive topics for this episode include war, poverty, abuse, prostitution, neglect, alcoholism, infidelity, and murder. If those are going to be upsetting for you, please come again to a different book club session that is more appropriate for you and your needs. I'll start by introducing you to the victim. Born James Gatz in 1887 and died Jay Gatsby in October 1922 at the age of 35 by a fatal gunshot wound. He was seen by all who surrounded him, save for his lover Daisy and closest friend Nick, as an eccentric, new money billionaire that not many people knew anything about.
Who are you?
I'm Pam. Who are you?
I'm the owner of this house.
However, he actually started off in extreme poverty.
Upper class, I have friends who are, working class, but I'm not working class, but I'm
Born in rural North Dakota to a poverty-stricken family of farmers, as any nepotism-wishing child would, he ran away to become rich. He tried to study at St. Olaf's College in Northfield, but as every broke university student knows, having a job and studying is a lot easier said than done. Instead of doing that, he did the next best thing, working for a millionaire sailor on his boat.
Capitalism really popped off today, ladies.
And Cody taught the now nicknamed Jay how to be, look like, and continue to be a perfect gentleman. If you don't know, they do teach this to British Prime Ministers at Eton.
Sarcasm.
When Cody dies in 1917, there was conveniently a war that Jay could go fight in so that he could get his Batman-style backstory. He meets the love of his life at a party in Kentucky, lies to her about his family, and promises to return to her after the war so they can be together when he has the prestige of being a veteran. Then, he made an enormous amount of wealth upon returning from the war by selling unlicensed alcohol during the period of Prohibition. Who is this love he met in Kentucky, I hear you say? This is Daisy Buchanan, or Daisy Faye when she met Gatsby for the first time. She was born in 1899 in Louisville, Kentucky. Her childhood seems to have been relatively uneventful, apart from her constantly overbearing mother. And she was presented in 1917 as a debutante in high society. Although she did have
Intimate relations.
with Gatsby and promised to wait for him, she marries Tom Buchanan in 1919. It was a huge public spectacle considering both families' immense fame. Tom Buchanan was an old money gentleman whose social club membership and polo skills appeared to make him husband material, totally forgetting about the alcohol, violence, and love for women of the night.
I can't get out of bed, no drugs make me bad. I can't get out of bed.
Their marriage was mainly one of convenience, although Daisy's diary does report love for Tom, even though a letter from Gatsby on the day of her wedding did almost derail the entire event. Our next key person in this case is Daisy's cousin Nick Carraway, whose therapy notes make up a significant portion of the information in this case. He was born in 1892 in Minnesota to a middle-class family. His great-uncle started the family's hardware business in 1851, ensuring the future wealth of his family. In 1921, he unknowingly moves into a small cottage next to Gatsby's house in order to be closer to Wall Street and his new job opportunities. We meet Jordan Baker, Daisy's cynical, high-society close friend, who, although we don't get much backstory from, we assume was also presented as a debutante in a similar way to Daisy. Finally, Myrtle Wilson and her husband George Wilson, the lady
of the night
Tom frequents, and the convicted killer of today's case. First in the story, which begins with Nick arriving in Long Island and starting up work in Wall Street, he studies finance in his spare time in order to get the jump on his career, but most of Wall Street in the 20s was all about connections, and Nick has absolutely none. Cue J. Gatsby inviting Nick to his home for one of his famous Gatsby parties. These parties will probably have made up the majority of the imagery that any of you who are familiar with this case will have seen. These were full of prohibition alcohol that had made Gatsby his money. It was a meeting place for gangsters, film stars, and every Tom, Dick, and Harry to join up and get drunk. Late that night, Nick is introduced to Jordan, Daisy's closest friend, and then Gatsby himself. He turns out to be the only one with an
actual invitation to this party?
Everyone else just seems to have turned up because they know it's happening. The days following this party are relatively quiet until Gatsby turns up on Nick's doorstep and essentially gives him an alcohol-based gangster rundown of the city. He makes Nick connections and gets him a much more solid job in Wall Street thanks to his connections. All for the price of a date. Honestly, people, if your partner isn't doing that to get a date with you, why are you going on the date?
The way to a woman's heart is truly giving her cousin a job and connections to the gangster underworld in order to pay him for setting up a date.
Anyway, Nick goes to Daisy's house later that night, but because her husband is there, he doesn't tell Daisy about the date. Instead, we hear about how sad she is and how she feels deeply disconnected from her daughter. The night is going perfectly well until Myrtle calls the home phone to get in touch with Tom. It's awkward as hell. The next important element is Nick and Tom going to visit Myrtle Wilson and her husband George Wilson, who run a mechanic shop that fixes up Tom's expensive new car. This is the woman, again, that sleeps with Tom in hotels behind the back of her husband and his wife. Shortly after this trip, Nick meets Jordan to have dinner. She discusses the connection between Gatsby and Daisy and their history, and then tells Nick he must set up their date to make both Gatsby and Daisy as happy as can be. Nick begins to think and prepare for this date. It happens to be absolutely beautiful, but because this is a crime-based show, we are going to skip over the details. I'm sorry for any of you romantics out there. After this date, Daisy and her husband, for some reason, attend one of Gatsby's parties, where most importantly for us, Daisy admits to Gatsby that although she had love for Tom, he is the one that she wants. A couple of days after this, Nick and Gatsby and Daisy spend an incredible day enjoying each other's company in what, if we saw this now, we would probably call a three-way date.
You ugly.
During this three-way date, Gatsby ends up revealing his Batman-style backstory. His parents aren't dead, they're just poor. There are, of course, other events that happen in the lives of these individuals, including Nick's career going up. But the next important part for this case is the social meetup of Jordan, Daisy, Tom, Nick, and Gatsby, which, as you can imagine, ends up with everyone basically revealing they're cheating on each other. It's not good. Gatsby and Daisy drive home in Tom's car, which we know from Daisy's diary.
I think it is Tom's car.
On their drive home, Myrtle sees this car on the road, thinking it's Tom, and runs into the road. She is hit by the car, which now know Daisy was driving. Daisy hits and runs it, the body is discovered by onlookers, and Tom turns up not long after that. He sees the horrifying scene and tells George that he saw Gatsby's car driving away from the crime scene.
Liar.
On the drive home with Daisy, Gatsby agrees to take the fall for everything. The fallout for this is, of course, huge, and Gatsby and Nick try and figure out the next course of action. While waiting for the dust to settle, Gatsby continues the parties to make everything seem normal. After one of these parties in particular, Gatsby goes swimming in his enormous, beautiful pool as it's the end of the summer and he won't be able to use it in the fall. During this seemingly peaceful swim, he is shot in the back by George Wilson. Admittedly, this is a very complex series of events, a lot of, dishonesty. Each person, apart from Nick and Jordan, who were honestly just alcoholics and not much else.
2 shots of vodka.
Having some guilt in the matter. So I'm going to simplify it for you. Daisy, who was cheating, suggesting they drive Tom's car, and killing someone. Tom, cheating and drunken violence. George, murder. And Gatsby, the posh gangster who pressured Daisy into thinking of her future right away and encouraging a hit and run. After all the events we've just gone through, Daisy is alerted to the death of Gatsby and leaves Long Island with Tom and her children.
Why are you running?
George Wilson is arrested and charged with no real incident. Gatsby's body and cause of death were determined fairly quickly by police, as his body was found face down in the pool by one of his cleaners, and since Tom had provided a visual report to George that Gatsby's car had been the one to strike his wife, a motive was determined very easily from that. George pled guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Nick was left alone to deal with the emotional consequences of this, as his closest friend Gatsby had died. His cousin Daisy had moved away with her family, and he never hears from Jordan again. This eventually leads him down the road of severe alcoholism.
Vodka?
Eventually leads to therapy, thank goodness for him, and the recording of all this events in his therapy notes. Although it is completely unethical for the hospital to have shared these notes, and I do not condone this in any way, the privacy of these notes had seemingly expired, and the hospital deemed them important historical fact. Well, we've come to the end of this week's book club meeting. What I've learnt from my research is that enough money may be able to make you happy, but do a hit and run in the car you bought with that money,
You will get murdered.
I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next book club meeting, where I'll be looking at an innocence-free case. A guilt is a death sentence, and death is a freedom. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.